right, hello. So it has been 60 days since I started learning Latin, so I thought it'd be fun to do another update. Typically, the way this goes is that you do more updates the earlier you are in the process, and then as you go along, it takes longer and longer to see progress, and it takes longer and longer to have anything interesting to say. And that was my experience learning French. So I imagine it'll be very similar. So there's always much to talk about at the beginning of your language learning journey, and I think mine is no different. So I thought I'd share what my progress is so far. How much Latin have I learned in 60 days? Have I changed my thoughts on the progress? Am I doing grammar exercises? Stay tuned. Okay, so why don't we start off with where I'm at in Lingua Latina, Persu Illustrata, Familia Romana. I think that's how it's pronounced. The LLPSI book. So let's take a look. Okay, so currently I am at chapter 33. I haven't read it yet, but I'm about to probably today sometime. And how's it going? It's going pretty well. I mean, it's hard. So my progress, to reiterate, is basically I just read through the text. If there's a word I don't recognize or understand, I just do a quick lookup on Wiktionary, and it tells me, what case it is or what tense it is, etc. And then I try to understand it. And then if there are other words in the sentence that I don't understand, I tend to look those up as well. Once in a while, I'll skip a sentence. If I'm like, what, this sentence is just not clicking, I've looked up all the words, but it still doesn't quite make any sense, I'll skip over it. Typically what happens when I reread the chapter, those weird sentences start to click, at least much more of them will click, because I have context of the whole story. I know what the story is about because I read through the whole story. And so that context tends to make the grammar make more sense. And once in a while, there'll be a strange sentence where I look at it, I've looked up all the words, I technically know what every word is doing, but together, there's something about the word order or something like that I just do not understand. But that's normal. That's just the nature of language learning. You're going to have these sort of situations that certain sentences or phrases will just be way harder, maybe 100 times harder than the typical sentence in that story. And the best thing to do is just skip it. Honestly, it really is. Because eventually, if you keep on doing easy stuff, the hard stuff will become easy eventually. And so worrying about every single sentence, every single phrase is kind of an anti-pattern when it comes to language learning. So in terms of my experience with Lingua Latina, I don't know if I got the long vowels right on that one, but that's okay. So it's going well. It's definitely been a bit of like a boot camp experience. So I think I left off at chapter 22, and there's definitely these like walls in the process. So walls as in you kind of get to the chapter and it is just it's much more difficult than the previous chapters, much more difficult than the chapter after it even. And there's really not much more to do than just to push through, in my opinion. Again, I think there's this tendency, I'm a bit of an outlier, I would say, in terms of my process of going through Latin. Because again, I learned French independently as an adult and I had my own process. So that kind of informed my language learning process. And I get the sense a lot of people coming to Latin, maybe most people are coming at it as a monolingual. Not everyone, but a lot of it's informed by that, and which is fine. And again, it's very possible that my process is wrong and maybe it's inefficient. I don't know. But yeah, so anyways, so there's definitely chapters in Lingua Latina or Familia Romana that I found pretty challenging, pretty tough to get through. The only thing to say is that just to push through really, and just keep on reading, read the supplements, try and read the next chapter, and eventually things will start to click. So in terms of, we can just quickly run through the chapters that I thought were notable or interesting or particularly difficult. Maybe if you've gone through Familia Romana, you yourself found it difficult. But let's talk about it. Let's talk about the hardest parts, maybe memorable chapters. So 22, I don't think I had read when I left off last 30 days. So Kawe Kanem. So that's a beware dog. So this is about the servant from the teacher from Marcus's school is sending this letter to complain about Marcus and how he's a bad student. And so he sent this letter with his servant, and the servant knocks on the door and talks with the guard, the doorman, and hilarity ensues. There's this mean dog that tries to bite and bark at the servant, or sorry, I should be saying slave. I've been saying servant, but definitely slaves, not just servants. But the slave would come and knock on the door, and the dog would bark at him and stuff. Really good chapter, actually. One of the better chapters, I would say. Like, again, not much of a story, but it's enough of one that I found it fairly entertaining. It was pretty goofy, a lot of fun. A bit of vocabulary dump at the beginning. Like, did I really need to know that cardo means like door hinge? Like, that has never come up yet again in Familia Romana. So it seemed kind of unnecessary, really, and I don't even think it came up again in the story, but I don't remember. There are some occasionally weird one-off words that don't really do much in terms of vocabulary. I guess the idea is it's supposed to highlight other words in the sentence or grammar concepts, so whatever. But some, what's it called when there's one word that only shows up once in a corpus? What's it called?
Hapax legomenon.
So they're called hapax legomenon, something like that. And yeah, they show up one word in the entire text. So there's a few of them like that. But anyways, long story short, I would say it's a pretty good chapter overall. I do enjoy, and I do like the interesting connection between Greek and Roman cultures. I find very interesting, and there's a little bit of that with like the slaves often are Greek, and I don't know, interesting. So yeah, so chapter 22, it's one of the better chapters. I wouldn't say it was particularly hard, but it was just average, like, challenging, because if it's the first time, lots of words I didn't know, new grammar concepts, but overall pretty smooth. Same thing with Epistula Magistri 23, fairly straightforward. There's challenging parts, but in general, relatively straightforward and not too bad. Chapter 24 with Lydia and telling a story, I believe, to Quintus. Is this the one where she tells a story about... No, she doesn't tell a story. I think she's just talking to Quintus and trying to make him feel better. And then I think it's the next chapter where she tells a story about Theseus and the Minotaur, and the King Minos. I don't know the words in English. And he got Daedalus, and the other person, his son, Icarus, and building the labyrinth and all that stuff. So this is definitely one of the better chapters. It's definitely one of those points, though, that gets hard. The book gets harder because it feels it's starting to get real. It feels less artificial, the language maybe. Maybe it's still very artificial. I don't know. What do I know about Latin? I'm still very much a beginner. But this is definitely one of the more notable chapters. A lot of vocab I didn't know, though. Really interesting. I liked it a lot. And again, very much an exciting story. Challenging, but a good challenge, because I did enjoy the story. And like I said, tons of vocab. The grammar, not so bad, but the vocab, definitely a ton. But really good. I really like that chapter. It's very memorable. Every time I see an Anki card with those sentences, I always like it quite a lot. The next one this is also one of my favorite chapters, Daedalus and Icarus, and their escape from the labyrinth, and Icarus famously flying too close to the sun and melting his wings. But overall, really good. Again, lots of vocab, not so easy, but not too bad. Once you learn the vocab, I didn't find it very hard. But again, these first two chapters, it feels like, the difficulty is up a notch in the textbook. This one, Res Rusticae, so I guess that's rural things, I guess you'd translate it. And this one is about farmers and stuff, and Julius, hanging out in the countryside and bullying his farmers, something like that. Again, not super hard, decent amount of vocab to learn, but I would say this one went smoothly. Next one is about 28. This is about Pericula Maris. This is where... Oh, this is the one with the big storm. It's after the big storm, and... Lydia. I guess it wasn't... It was Sura. It was the Greek slave who was telling the story to Quintus. Quintus, and Lydia is the lover of Medus. I'm assuming they're lovers. Like, it's very PG description of the relationship. I don't know if in Latin language, like friends is mean? Are they trying to like, are they being euphemistic, or is that just how they're referred to? Like in French, like, like my little friend, petite amie, is how you would say boyfriend or girlfriend, or really that's kind of old fashioned. You just say mon copain, for example, or my friend. It's like that possessive makes it like your girlfriend, boyfriend. Ma copine, yeah, ma copine. But I don't know. But yeah, it's a little bit PG, their relationship, but clearly they're lovers. But I don't know. But anyways, this is the one where she talks about Jesus Christ and how it's Christianity is her religion, and there's excerpts from the Vulgate, which is pretty cool. I've been looking at a little bit at the Vulgate. Just like I'm not Christian, but it is interesting to read it as the text. And at one point I definitely want to read at least the New Testament, just because some of these stories, like I've never actually read the New Testament from cover to cover, and it would be an interesting. It's not that long, the New Testament, so I probably wouldn't want to read the Old Testament. It's much longer, so maybe one day we'll see. Just because it's so influential on Western culture, but it is cool to see like actual, real deal Latin from the Vulgate in the book, and that's fun to read. Again, average challenge. It doesn't stand out. A fairly long chapter, but it doesn't stand out to me as a particularly tough one. Navigare necessest. Hopefully that's right. This one was about. This one I found pretty tough. This was, I guess, talking about. This was the what is it? The guvernator, the captain of the ship. He's telling stories about different mythological people, kind of like the stories in Fabulae Syrae. And this one was a bit tougher, I would say. It's pretty bit of a slog, this one, but I think it was good. Like I like the stories, but it was a bit tougher, definitely. Let's see. Conwiwium. I think that's right. So this one average, not so hard. I didn't find it very hard. And same thing with this is about, I guess they're having a big meal, and the next chapter is very similar. It's another chapter where they're just kind of talking and chatting about stuff. Not super hard. Both chapters pretty accessible, I would say. And then finally last night I did chapter 32. This one was a bit harder. It was a bit of a slog. Like the first time going through it, I was just like banging my head against the desk, and it's pretty tough. But now that I read back it, like usually, and I fight my way through the chapter, and then I read it relatively fluidly all the way through. And I would say it went pretty fine. Like things started to click. There's definitely one or two phrases here and there that I'm like, I don't really, like I vaguely know what they're talking about because I understand what all the words are, but there's some reason it doesn't all stick together. So that's pretty much it. Again, there's definitely chapters where it feels like it's like, how am I going to understand this? This is impossible. It's too weird. But honestly, my experiences have been so far just honestly pushing through and doing some rereading. I didn't intend to ever do much rereading of the book when I first started LLPSI, Familia Romana, but a little bit of rereading has been helpful, I found, and just to solidify some of the concepts. But I'm still not doing any of the pensa. I'm not doing any of exercises or anything like that. Again, people have different opinions on this, but I'm not going to learn all the grammar of Latin in Familia Romana. It's impossible. There's 35. I think I did. I last update I said there was 20,000 words in Familia Romana. I think there's about 35,000, something like that, approximately. But that's still like so tiny. That's so little content and so little input. Like you can't learn the grammar and then try and understand the language, right? You have to learn to understand the language before you understand the grammar. And you can definitely memorize tables and know all the verb charts and all the case endings and stuff. You can memorize that. But is that going, and you can do all the fill in the blank exercises, but that's still just conscious knowledge, and you still need to get input. Now, there is something to be said for that conscious knowledge, and what is the exact relationship between grammar study and acquisition of the language? Truthfully, I don't think anyone knows precisely. We do know that people who are interested in grammar and care about it assuming they get enough input, tend to be better grammatically. So there does seem to be a relationship, but that exact balance, maybe that's a preference thing. But personally, my experience, at least with French, so much of the stuff you don't need to learn ahead of time. You can just learn from context, and that like you're going to have to do a lot of work to get your reading level up to a certain level, and you can't shortcut that with learning a lot of grammar, like memorizing the charts. Like it helps, I'm sure it helps. It absolutely helps, but let's say you have to do X amount of work. Let's say you do X amount of reading to get to a certain level. Along the way, there's going to be a certain percentage that you're just going to absorb naturally. Like, you'll notice the patterns, and over time, you won't have to think about, like, you won't have to actively memorize the charts because they'll just be acquired. You'll just know it in your gut, like in the same way you know English or whatever your native language is, and you'll just acquire it. And there will be slivers, there will be part of the language that will take much longer, and that a little bit of conscious study can help that click at least a little bit faster. At least that was my experience with French. And or maybe that's just an illusion. Maybe that like it just gives us the illusion because we can consciously think about it and help produce the language and help when we're listening or reading it, but it may not actually influence. But my gut is from anecdotal experience, the grammar study helps, but I'm skeptical how much. Like again, people have this idea that we have to memorize every case ending, every grammatical rule ahead of time before you actually get to the real language, actually reading the real stuff. Whereas, in my perspective, you learn that stuff by reading the real stuff. And you only need to learn enough grammar so that you can understand the messages, even just in general, even just the gist. As long as you understand the flow of the story, you're going to start noticing the patterns. You're going to start absorbing the grammar and the vocabulary more and more and more. It's just inevitable. There was an example. So someone mentioned in the comments in my first video that, so I said wale as a way to say hello. And I corrected on the screen. I said salve, which also means hello. And the person mentioned that wale is also perfectly fine to say hello. And I was like, why did I think wale was why did I say that just naturally? It's because in a Magister Craft, the Minecraft video Latin guy, he had a video where there was just a person who said wale, and it kind of demonstrated my point in a way that like subconsciously I knew that wale meant like hello or bye, I guess. And I didn't have to think about it. It was just there. And then it was only on reflection and through the analysis that I thought, oh, that's wrong because salve is the right way to say it. And so it kind of just shows, first of all, like the power of audiovisual content to cement stuff purely unconsciously. But it also shows that sometimes the analytical aspect of thinking about a language can actually interfere with the actual acquisition. So in reality, I think people are a little bit too confident when they talk about the science of language learning, because there's so much about language learning we really don't know, and like how it actually works, the mechanisms, and what is the precise relationship between memorizing vocabulary and acquiring vocabulary, studying grammar rules and acquiring the rules, and the rate of speed, how that affects that, and stuff like that, and like also like the relationship between the difficulty of a text and the speed of the text. And, we have rough anecdotal ideas, that we do know some grammar study helps, but it's not necessary. And that generally speaking, leveling your content, that try and start with easier stuff first and slowly build over time is generally a more efficient strategy. But that being said, again, with like the content and the difficulty, at the end of the day, it's never going to be a perfectly smooth line of progression. There's always going to be bumps. You'll get into a book and there'll be a chapter that's just like super hard, and that's just inevitable. You're never going to have a perfectly smooth line, and so some struggle is just inevitable, and just accepting the ambiguity of the language is just part of language learning. But in general, don't just jump straight to the hardest people out there and just bang your head. It's probably going to be a much slower process than, but at the same time, don't be afraid of jumping into harder stuff. At least that's my perspective. Okay, so that's that. Let's talk a little bit about Anki. And so in terms of my statistics, so I've been very happy. Okay, so I've been very happy that I've been able to get my times per card down. It was getting pretty long per card, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So today it was only 9 seconds per card, which is great. Getting it under 10 seconds I think is important. It makes it relatively speedy. It's a good time. And so my percentages were not actually that great today. So I got only 81% for mature cards, which are cards that I haven't seen for over 3 weeks, or intervals more than 3 weeks, I believe. And which is not great. Although if you look at my statistics, so my statistics for the year, so for learning cards, 83%, that's fine, that's pretty normal. My young cards around 87%, meaning that I get them right 87% of the time, and my mature cards are 86.75%. I think this is a little bit low, mainly because of the card format, and but if you look, and if you remember from my last video, if you watch that, my leach threshold for Anki, there's a lot of Anki terminology. If you don't know what Anki is, this video is probably not super understandable, but I mentioned that if I make a mistake 3 times on a card, I suspend it automatically, so I never see that card again. And so on one hand, I have 90 suspended cards. That's 90 words I failed on, 90 cards, which seems like a lot, 7% of all my cards. On the flip side, that means that there are 1,193 cards that I memorized perfectly fine. And 1,200 cards over 2 months is a lot. Like, that is quite a lot of cards. That's again almost 20 a day, and 20 a day in Anki and actually remembering it is a huge amount. Like in general, 20 is too much for most people, as I mentioned in the last video. So even though it seems a little high, 90 words that I failed on too much, and I just suspended it from my deck. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter because there's still 1,200 words in Latin that I do memorize. I did memorize at a pretty high level. So yeah, so I would say Anki is going really well. Now I have made a difference. I have made a change. I made a change with my format of my cards. And I might have mentioned this in the last video that there's like kind of 2 main ways of formatting your cards. So the main way that I mentioned last video is that you put just a single word on the front, you put the English translation on the back, and then the whole Latin sentence on the back. And your job is to read this, try and remember the translation, and read the last sentence to clarify your understanding of the word. And if you have an English sentence, you're welcome to look at that, but I don't do that very often. So how did I change my Anki cards? So I found that it became harder and harder or more mentally taxing to start learning these words just as single word, and then translation, even if there was the sentence on the back. So now what I have now is this is exactly the way I did it with French. And so, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So I put the entire sentence on the front. Ideally, I would understand absolutely everything in the sentence except the one word that I highlighted. So let's see if I can read it. Excuse my pronunciation. Nunc demum intellego me... No, try again. Nunc demum intellego me tibi vita cariorem esse. So hopefully your ears have recovered from that. But so basically, I don't read it aloud. That takes way too long. Sometimes I do just for fun, but I'm not worried about pronunciation at this point. But I basically read the whole sentence. I look at the highlighted word. Do I understand what that word means? So this means like finally, for example. So nunc demum intellego me tibi vita cariorem esse. So this, I think the way it would be translated would be, now I finally understand how much value my life is to you. Something like that. Hopefully that's right. Sorry if that's wrong. But the main thing is just to learn the word. But I'm pretty sure this is like a little bit fuzzy, this grammar. Like, I think I get the gist, but it's possible that it's a slight misinterpretation. Cariorem, I think, just means like how much value something is, and but hopefully the grammar works. But anyways, the main idea is I'm reading the sentence, and then the main objective is just, do I know that word? And it's possible that certain sentences, I don't have a 100% locked down and perfect understanding other than that one word, but in general, that's the goal. And why did I switch? So main reason is that I found it harder and harder to remember what the words meant, like in a single word. And oftentimes words in Latin, the first letter and like the ending will be very similar to many other words. Like the one I struggled with was nequam versus numquam. So the first one meaning like worthless, the other one meaning never. And they have like similar-ish meanings, and they're spelled very similarly. But I found it too hard to keep in track. Now I have them in my head well separated, but it was stuff like that, and just in general, it's really annoying to view a word in isolation. And what I found was doing the sentence cards. I call these sentence cards. The other ones I call them vocab cards. It just feels like I'm in Latin more, that I'm reading the sentence, and then I flip just slightly out of Latin for a second to just check the English definition. But most of the time, it feels like I'm just reading lots of sentences that I basically understand well because I pull them out of the book and in general understand them well. And I found the process just more pleasurable. And most importantly, I think I'm just getting more reading practice in general. It feels better. And one thing I've been thinking about is, does the format of your Anki card depend on the language you're learning? because like as you know, like Latin, it's really about like how all the words work together and in combination, and you can't really look at the words individually because again the case endings like uh, there's this interaction between all the words. You have to kind of view the sentence as a whole, and so thinking of words in isolation doesn't really make sense. Whereas it was never really a problem with French. And so I wonder if that's a result of like the very fixed word order of French, and that in Latin, really the most of the difficulty is getting used to the word order and how words can be different parts of the sentence and paying attention to the endings and how they interact. And so maybe sentence cards just work better with Latin because of that flexible word order. And maybe other languages where that's not as much of an issue, it's really then maybe isolated vocab cards work better. I don't know. But my impression is that I feel like it's certainly more pleasurable studying Anki with the sentence cards, which is the most important thing. And I don't think it's hurting my progress. And, maybe there's a slight benefit to the vocab cards just because they are in isolation and it forces you to memorize them slightly better. But I'm not sure it's worth the trade-off. And again, just subjectively, it really feels like when it's just the vocab cards, it feels like I'm spending too much time in English mode. Whereas with the sentence cards, it's most of the time just reading sentences, checking really quickly just to double check the English definition, and then flipping back just to the Latin. Kind of like a gloss, I guess. And so that's my impression. So I feel like it's better. Now, I don't remember exactly what chapter I switched over, but I probably should have done it earlier. And my recommendation to you is, if you're, learning in a similar way that I am, definitely start with the vocab cards, just because, as I mentioned in the previous video, when you're first starting, it is so painful to read a sentence for the first time. Literally any Latin sentence will take so much brain power that it just takes way too long and too painful to read full sentences just to learn the vocab. And so it's much better just to learn, just put like I showed before, Latin word, English translation, and then the example sentence. Always put the example sentence so that you have that context. And I think that reduces the cognitive load when you're starting. But at a certain point, once you start getting comfortable with understanding basic sentences, I think it is better, at least for my learning preferences, to switch to this sentence card style. And the question is, when do you do that? I don't know. Like, I definitely waited too long, I believe. So I probably could have done it earlier. Now, one problem with the sentence card structure is that it sort of implies that there's only one word always that you don't know in the sentence. And as I mentioned in the previous video, one of the problems with Familia Romana is that oftentimes they might introduce several new words that you haven't been mentioned before in the same sentence, plus maybe a brand new grammar concept, which makes it very unideal to sentence mime. And there's different ways around it. Now, one thing you could do is just accept that and just make one card that looks like this, where you highlight this word, and maybe say you didn't know intellego, for example. You could make a separate card that has the exact same sentence, and you'd highlight that one, and then give what that means to understand in the first person, singular, indicative, or whatever. And so that's what I've been doing, basically. And I found it like less and less of a problem, that the vocabulary is less of the issue in terms of like too many words per phrase. And if there's a sentence that I feel like I should learn, and there's two words in the sentence, I just do what I said. I just make two cards with the same sentence, one for one for the other. And it works fine because each card works together and they reinforce each other. So it's not that big a deal. It's probably a bigger deal earlier in the book. So I don't know, like I would say somewhere between chapter 20 and chapter 30 is probably a good point to make that flip over. I waited probably a little bit too long. Maybe a good chapter would be the chapter where the Minotaur and like Theseus and killing the Minotaur. That would probably be my intuition is like a good spot to make the switch over, but it's hard to say. So yeah, but anyways, I would say it's been going well. One thing I noticed is that the amount of unknown vocab is slowing down a little bit in Familia Romana, and I'm very close to the end. I only have a couple chapters left, but I almost feel like the 20 cards a day has been working really well, but it's kind of hard to keep up with it, to find enough words. Like there were some chapters where I probably put 80 words into Anki from it, 60 to 80 words, and so one chapter would give me 3 or 4 days of extra Anki cards. But now it's like I might get 1 or 2 days max at 20 cards a day. So it might just mean that I have to transition now to just 10 words a day. And as you get better and better at the language, the amount of words you can learn in Anki per day starts to decrease. That was my experience with French. So 20 is probably, by the time I finish Familia Romana, probably switching to 10 a day is probably better. We'll see. Maybe when I start, maybe when I start doing like more native texts, Julius Caesar and Cicero and, the other easier, the authors people tend to read. Maybe I'll find that, again, the vocabulary will be so much more that I'll have to start doing 10, 20 again. But I don't anticipate it. I'll probably just stick to 10. But I'm just going to stay the course, finish Familia Romana at 20 a day, and go from there probably, and probably drop it down to 10. And realistically, yeah, I probably should be doing less Anki and more reading. But in general, it hasn't been taking me too long to do Anki. I did 20. It's been about 20 minutes per day, I would say. And it's been great. I would say the vocabulary is doing really well. Again, it's more grammar, I would say, than vocabulary, which, the people who really like exercises might be saying, no, you must do the exercises, and that's going to solidify your understanding. I'm skeptical. I'm very skeptical because, again, my experience is that there's a conscious knowledge and unconscious are two separate things. And so much of the understanding of the language will just come naturally if you just keep on trying to understand it, as long as it's somewhat level appropriate. And that you're wasting a lot of time devoted to memorizing those tables when those tables would come naturally. I never memorized verb tables and in French, for example, and I learned all those conjugations just fine, just through exposure. So maybe at one point I'll find it necessary to really be like, these are all the case endings, these are all the verb endings, and I will devote those to memory. But I'm really not worried about that right now. Like, I am continuously progressing. I'm not going to be like, what? I'm not learning. I can't progress with Latin anymore. I must learn those tables now. I'm a little skeptical. And my understanding, just intuitively, like, it's rare that it's like, oh, is that a genitive or is that dative or is that ablative? Like, rarely is that the issue that's preventing me from understanding a sentence. Like, occasionally, but most of the time, if I'm like, is that the genitive? I should look that up. And it's like, yes, in fact, it is the genitive. Or is that the accusative? I should look it up, and it turns out it usually is. So it's rarely the issue that I can't identify the case ending, or maybe even like the verb, what tense it is. I would say that's very rarely the case. Very once in a while, but very rarely. It's really word order, I would say, and just reading ability in general that's holding me back. That I'll read a sentence and I'll understand every single word in the sentence, but it just doesn't click together as like one as an pure understanding. And then sometimes I'll just look up the words or whatever, and then I'll read it again, and then all of a sudden it just clicks. And again, it's unconscious. You can't reading ability is unconscious. You can't control it in a conscious way. You just have to expose yourself to more sentences and read more. So yeah, I mean, again, maybe I'll be like, in 2 or 3 months, I'll be like, you were all right. I should have memorized those tables. I should have done the Dowling method and memorized every verb ending and every case ending ahead of time and done all those Penson exercises and stuff. But I'm a little skeptical because I'm learning just fine with just the way I've been going without doing the exercises, looking up words, occasionally checking, what case this is and stuff. And, I have a feeling that it'll be fine, but we'll see. So I don't really have much more to say. I've been talking probably enough. I have been going through Fabulae Syrae. I would say actually one thing else I mentioned before I talk about that is one thing I anticipated is that learning Latin would deepen my understanding of the French language, because as I mentioned, I know French pretty decently, and that's not at all been the case. I feel like my understanding of English has deepened a lot because there's a lot of just Latin stuff in English that has been transplanted into it, and that I never knew that's where it came from. And my understanding of English, I think, has grown from Latin, but not really French, because the stuff that I recognize that's in French is basically the same. Like, a lot of the way verbs work in Latin is very similar to French. And so it's just like, oh yeah, that's the subjunctive and perfect, basically the same as in French, or like, oh, we're using the infinitive with the other conjugation. Yeah, it's basically like in French. Or it's like, oh, that word, basically kind of like what it is in French. And that kind of thing, it's like, it's too close in a way, and it's not like revealing anything particularly insightful about the French language. What I expected would be like, oh, that weird thing that we always do in French, oh, that's where that comes from because it was originally in Latin. And occasionally there's things like that, but Maybe I'll discover that later on as I go on, but for now, it's been kind of not that. It's just been more like, yep, it's kind of like in French, I guess, because it descends from it. And whoop-de-doo, I guess. But yeah, definitely more in English. Like the fact that I would say, like, I see where words come from and stuff. I would say that it's been much more illuminating. So a little disappointing in the sense that I don't feel like my knowledge of French has been deepened from learning about the language that it came from. And one of like the main benefits, I would say, only main benefits of learning French first is that like the Greek y or the y letter, like in Syrae, like that sound is in French u, and so I don't have to like learn that. And so phonetically, I guess that's like the only advantage. And like some of the grammar concepts are relatively similar from French and Latin, so that's been a boost as well, specifically with the verbs, but some other things as well. Yeah, anyways, that's that. Fabulae Syrae. So where am I at in that? So if we go to this, I think I'm at in the chapter that's based on chapter 29 of Familia Romana, the third story, Aretusa. And this has been going well. Some chapters have been very smooth. I can just kind of read through it, basically. The occasional lookup word, but in general, very smooth. I'll just read a sentence and I'll be just like, I understand this. This is great. Some chapters are a bit more of a slog. I'm just like, oh, this word order is very different than Orberg's word order, and it's just a little more difficult. And it's not really like I don't know it. The problem is like the cases I don't know or something, or I don't recognize this tense. It's just sometimes certain combinations, my brain just doesn't recognize it right away, but I'm sure over time it'll get better. So yeah, so everything's going pretty much to plan from before. Familia Romana was a little bit more rough, I would say, a bit more of a boot camp experience than I expected. I expected it to be a bit more smoother experience compared to what, from what, people talked about it as this genius textbook, and it is a good textbook, but it's been a bit more of a bumpy ride, I would say, through Familia Romana. But again, I've only been studying Latin for 2 months, so I think in that context, I've made a lot of progress, and I think I'm doing fine. And so, what is my plan for... and I finished reading Colloquia Personarum, which is the other supplement text that accompanies the first 25 chapters of Familia Romana, and that went well. I liked it. It was fun. So yeah, that went relatively smoothly. No real issues with that. So what is my plan for the next month? So my plan is, I just have, in the next few days, I should be able to finish Familia Romana. Someone mentioned that I should save the last chapter until I read all of Fabulae Syrae. I'm not sure I'll do it. I don't know. Like, I kind of just want to be like, I'm so close to the end of Familia Romana. I just kind of want to fly through it. I'm sure there'll be poetry I don't understand or it'll be confusing. It's fine. I'm not expecting to perfectly understand the poetry, so I'll probably just for completionist's sake, just fly through it. And then I want to finish reading Fabulae Syrae. I'll do that. And then once I've done that, I need to read through Fabulae Latinae, which is the other accompanied text that covers the first 35 chapters of Familia Romana, just to get extra practice. I'm like toying with the idea of rereading all of Familia Romana, Colloquia Personarum, Fabulae Syrae, and as just like one go, just like one big story. I'm not sure I'll do that. I keep on going back and forth. It's like, oh, it'd be such a good review, but it's like, oh, that'd be so boring. Like, I just kind of want to move on and do something else other than Familia Romana. So probably not. I'm probably not going to reread the whole thing, but it would be a nice way to kind of just like be like, okay, I am done with Familia Romana. I'm, out of that world. But I don't know. I haven't decided yet. We'll see. But yeah, the basic plan for this month, this week, I should be able to finish Familia Romana, and then I'll be able to finish, and then ideally finish. Definitely finish Fabulae Syrae this month as well as Fabulae Latinae. I would say it would be very likely I'll finish those. And I thought about doing things like going through Asimil. Like there's Asimil Latin, which it's in French, which is great for me. But again, it's like, do I really want to go through another beginner textbook? Or the same thing with like the Cambridge Latin course. Like I could just read through it just for good reading practice. But I'm like, do I really want to like go through one of those textbooks again? Like I kind of don't want to, is the thing. And the thing with language learning is like, I don't want to do things I don't want to do. So I probably won't do that. We'll see. Maybe I will, but it seems unlikely. And then again, once I finish Fabulae Syrae, finish Fabulae Latinae, Then I want to just start doing reading a bunch, reading novellas as much as I can. Probably Septimus, just because like I said, I mentioned that 30 days ago. I really want to read that book for whatever, I'm not sure why. It just seemed kind of cool. And I've like looked a little bit at the Vulgate, like I mentioned before, and definitely want to start that at one point. I found a list of like public domain Latin readers and they're listed based on like unique word counts and just overall word count. And going through that is probably going to be more interesting, And people always mention Ad Alpes, which is one of the more famous novellas to help teach Latin, to help bridge the gap between textbook Latin and Caesar Latin. And I've glanced at it a little bit. Again, it doesn't seem like, again, because I've gone through Familia Romana, there's not really like aspects of the language that are like, I mean, I'm sure there are like small corners of the language that I don't know, obviously, but like for the most of what's out there in terms of Latin grammar, like I've been exposed to in some small way at the very least. So there's nothing like creeping around the corner that I'm gonna be like, wow, this isn't even the same language anymore. So looking at a little bit of Ad Alpes, it doesn't actually seem particularly like crazy hard. I mean, some vocabulary, obviously, that I don't know, but it seems very comparable to the stuff I've been reading already. And again, one thing I should mention is that I'm very likely on the Dunning-Kruger curve in a not a good spot. So here, one sec. So in case you don't know, the Dunning-Kruger effect is this idea that the less you know, the more overconfident you are in your ability. And the more you learn, the more you realize how little you actually know. So if I had to guess where I am on this list, so at the beginning you don't know anything, so your confidence is low, and then you start learning more and more and more, you become more and more confident, and then you get to the peak of Mount Stupid where you don't know enough to know that you don't know very much. And so you're very confident, but you don't actually know very much. And my suspicion is this is where I am right now. I'm about to go over to the cliff. And so I feel very confident, but at the same time, there's so much Latin I don't know yet. And that's where I suspect I am. And then I'm going to read a little bit more. I'm like, just going to be like, I don't know almost anything about Latin. And I've gone through that experience before with French, going up and down the curve and like, at the top of Mount Stupid many times. So my suspicion is this where I am, and then I'll get a little bit better and realize I'm not as good as I think I am. So that's a suspicion, if I'm being brutally honest. So if I feel very upbeat about my Latin learning, it's probably because I am right here. But just the way it goes, you go through the valley of despair, and as you get better and better and better, you truly get to a level that you are good at the language or whatever skill you're learning. But yeah, so that's my plan for the next 30 days. Finish Familia Romana, finish Fabulae Syrae, finish Fabulae Latinae, start working through Septimus. I should be able to do that. I see no reason why I can't do that. That seems all very achievable, very reasonable. And probably what I'll do is I'll start a brand new sentence mining deck with 10 new cards per day once I finish Familia Romana. Just kind of like, that's my starter deck. In fact, maybe I'll just, if anyone wants it, they can have it if they like. I don't know how good quality it is, and there's probably, but if people want it, they can try it. It's fine. But yeah, so like I said, overall reflections in the last month, I would say it's going really well. A little bit bumpier than I expected, I guess, but overall it's been a fun time. I've been enjoying it. Haven't really been doing a lot of listening. I did a little bit listening sometimes when I'm making dinner or whatever, listening to Carla Hertz videos or Magister Craft videos. And I haven't really done tons of the Luke Ranieri's podcast yet. I listened to one episode and I can understand the gist of it, but it's still a little rough. But I'm not really prioritizing audio, even though, as I mentioned before, it is so beneficial. But I don't know. We'll see. But yeah, so that's my progress the last 30 days. In a way, not very exciting because it's a little bit in progress, but it'll be more interesting to see where I'm at the end of next 30 days, because I'll be, for the first 3 months, I should be in a lower intermediate, maybe. I still feel very much like a beginner, but hopefully I'll be lower intermediate at that point, and off to the races. So if you have any questions, let me know, and bye.